here we go. We are in Isaiah chapter 2, and beginning with verse 5, we are about to begin looking at the prayer that is being made. Verse 6. And we say it's a prayer because the person that is being addressed has changed. Listen to the wording. Therefore thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they be replenished from the east, and are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers. Obviously he's talking to the Lord. It's the Lord who has forsaken his people. And so when you notice changes like that, from an expositional point of view, it gives you a natural unit when the person changes, whether it's first person or in the third person or second person. Let's notice the sins that they are involved in here. There are some sins mentioned and reasons why God has forsaken them in this prayer, and it tells us this in verse 7. Their land also is full of silver and gold, neither is there any end of their treasures. Okay, so obviously their wealth, their material wealth, is a problem and has contributed to their moral downfall. Is there anything wrong with being rich? Okay, it's the love of money. There's nothing wrong with a coin. There's nothing wrong with currency in and of itself. But it's our heart's attachment to the thing that causes the problem. The next problem in verse 7. Their land is also full of horses, neither is there any end of their chariots. What's the problem with that? Does God not like horses? Does he? Okay. Okay, can you think of a passage anywhere that forbids Israel from accumulating horses?
Yes.
Go right back to Deuteronomy. In fact, let's look it up. Deuteronomy 17. Would somebody look there and read it? Deuteronomy 17, verse 16 and 17. Do you have a cross-reference there? Okay, he shall not multiply horses to himself. Any idea why? We're not talking about alliances or being influenced by other nations. We're just talking about building up military might. Why doesn't God want Israel to be militarily strong? Pardon me?
Don't forget to relying on God. God is real.
That's right.
The Savior of
Who is the captain of the hosts? Jehovah. That's right. I believe it says it right in that passage in Deuteronomy too. The reason why. Another passage in Deuteronomy is chapter 18, verses 10 to 11. What do we have there? Would somebody like to read that? Should have asked you while you were back there, James. Deuteronomy 18. Would somebody turn there, please? Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 and 11.
There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter or a witch, or a charmer or a counselor, or a consulter rather, with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer.
Okay. What's a necromancer? Somebody? Well, let me quickly give you
a lot of people nowadays necromancy.
18. Got nothing with romance. Chapter 18, verse 10 and 11 in the NIV. A spiritist who consults the dead. Yeah. Okay, so those are some things that the children of Israel are specifically forbidden to do. And here in this prayer, Isaiah is saying, their land also is full of silver and gold, neither is there any end of their treasures. Their land is full of horses, neither is there any end of their chariots. Their land also is full of idols. They worship the work of their own hands, that which their own fingers have made. And the mean man boweth down, and the great man humbles himself. Therefore forgive them not. In this context, in other words, the big, mighty men of renown, the strong men who ought to be leading the people of God, are bowing down and humbling themselves before these idols. And of course, along with that goes all the spiritism and other practices that are forbidden in the book of Deuteronomy. I want you to notice the repetition, and when you're in the prophets or when you're in poetic sections, look for words that repeat themselves. The word idol is repeated in verse 8, 18, and 20. Verse 18, the idols he shall utterly abolish. Verse 20, in that day a man shall cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats. The humbling of men is repeated in verse 9, 11, and 17. The mean man bows down, the great man humbles himself, therefore forgive them not. Verse 11, the lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Verse 17, the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be made low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. It's exactly word for word repetition. This is part of the poetry of the thing.
What was the first verse of that?
Verse 9, 11, and 17. The fleeing of judgment is also repeated 3 times. Verse 10, enter into the rock and hide thee in the dust. Enter the rock, enter into caves, okay? Hide in the dust for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty. Verse 19, and they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake terribly the earth. Verse 21, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the tops of the ragged rocks for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake terribly the earth. So there's almost word for word repetition again. When you see that, it's a clue as to the structure of the chapter. And when you begin to see that, you can start building a sermon or a lesson around that, because that's the way it breaks apart. That's the way it's laid out. Okay. So this picture is one of increasing desperation, as men will seek to escape God's judgment, and there will be no escape. It seems like the major concern in this chapter is the pride and the haughtiness of man. Idolatry is always an outgrowth of pride, I believe, just by way of application. I mean, let's discuss that. What do you think? Pride always seems to result in one form of idolatry or another. Now, we are not necessarily bowing down and worshipping stone idols or statues of any kind, but does that mean to say we have no problem with idolatry in North America? Hardly. I think we have a major problem with idolatry.
In pride, another concept is lack of faith. And when I feel the lack of faith, I more rely on the money, tax, or something I can rely on.
Yeah.
Or we have enough faith.
Here's an interesting definition of idolatry that has always stuck with me. And I should have said, and I will never forget it because it is burned into my heart, and I forgot it. Idolatry occurs when I look to anything beside God to give me what only God was meant to give me. Idolatry occurs whenever I look to anything but God to give me what only God can give me. some statements as simple as, man, that's living, can be an idolatrous statement. Because Jesus said, I am come that you might have life and that you might have it more abundantly. And if we look to anything besides Jesus Christ as a source of life, it's a form of idolatry. Agree or disagree? Yeah. What do you think motivates most of mankind? They are looking for something that only heaven can give. We are made for heaven. We are made for immortality. So the things that move us are those things on the other side of the Garden of Eden. Eternity in our hearts. And so we go to drugs, we try sex, we try alcohol, we try all kinds of different things to satisfy that deep, deep, deep longing that each one of us have. And that's idolatry, if we don't go to God to fill that need.
Actually, the Israel people, they start to idolatry, to worship the different God, because they expect something could happen in good abundance, which they think they can receive something good for the foreign God.
Yeah.
So kind of greed or the desperate anticipation, some kind of blessing from foreign God that is invited to.
Yeah, there's no doubt that they used God for what they could get. Yeah. So pride and haughtiness is the major concern of that chapter. And in verse 22 we have the final stamp put on it, where King James says, Cease ye from man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted of? Do you understand that? Did anyone understand that? What it means is, don't put your trust in man. Don't put your trust in man. Remember Jesus, who did not commit himself to anyone because he knew what was in the heart of man? Stop trusting in man. This is the NIV. Who has but a breath in his nostrils. Of what account is he?
Then means also don't trust yourself.
That's true. But primarily, we're talking here, I think, about leadership, because in the next chapter, this verse 22 is a transitional verse that leads us into the next chapter, because the next chapter is a wholesale condemnation of the leaders of Israel. And I'm telling you, today we are living in such a time where we cannot put our trust in human ability to lead or to govern. Someone promising comes along like Robert Dole or Preston Manning or whoever, and they sound like they're Christians, and I'm sure Preston Manning is. I don't know about Bob Dole. Christians get all excited and get on the bandwagon and get involved, and I don't think there's anything wrong with Christian involvement. I think there ought to be lots of it. But it's not long before good men in office are discovered to also be faulty. And they blow it. No matter how good you are, we cannot put our trust in man, and as long as the Lord does not return, we will have one government after another that will fail, will not be able to deliver on their promises. So, don't put our trust in human ability to lead or to govern. We are mortals, and we are sinners, and we are deceived, and we are deceivers. Alright, any questions or comments as we move on from chapter 2 to chapter 3? Then moving on, and here we have the caption or the heading, Judgment Against a Defiant Nation. Judgment Against a Defiant Nation. You have that heading in your notes already, but if you want to rewrite it, that's fine with me. I already mentioned that the last verse of the previous chapter is a transition to the topic of a lack of leadership among God's people. Notice in verses 1 to 3, that God, first of all, by way of judgment, is going to remove all support systems. He's going to remove the essentials for living. It says in King James here, "For behold, the Lord of hosts, doth take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread and the whole stay of water." In other words, their reserves are going to be gone. King James, "See now, the Lord, NIV, the Lord Almighty is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support, all supplies of food and all supplies of water." Then he moves on and says that he will remove all qualified leadership from responsibility. The mighty man and the man of war, the judge and the prophet, the prudent and the ancient, the captain of 50 and the honorable man, and the counselor and the cunning artificer, that's the artisan, the craftsman, and the eloquent orator. So leaders are going to be removed, whether they are military leaders, political leaders, or religious leaders. All are going to be removed. Turn to 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 14, and would somebody read that, please? 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 14. And here we have the fulfillment of this prediction.
And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of Ador, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land.
Okay, none remained except the poorest people of the land. They left the poverty-stricken behind. They were the ones who were left to more or less govern themselves as the powers of Babylon carried off all the cream of the crop of society, so to speak. The leaders were all taken away. So there we have the fulfillment. Then in verses 4 to 7, again, God's judgment is that children will be allowed to be in leadership, or at least to be assertive. God will allow children to be rebellious and independent and oppressive. Listen to this. "I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. And the people shall be oppressed, every one by another, every one by his neighbor." It sounds like the feudal system is coming back here, and everyone needs to buttress their homes and to build fortresses and hide behind. It's like a siege mentality from house to house. I preached once, just in Batchawana on. I forget the passage that I spoke from, but I asked the question: imagine for a moment if the powers that be said that for 1 month in a given region, let's say in the municipal or the regional boundaries of Goulais River, whatever that is, there will be no law. No law will be enforced. You can do what you want, and we will not come after you for 30 days, and then after that, law will be established again, and we will not prosecute anyone for anything. There is no law, so you can't be guilty of any law, can't be convicted of any crime for 30 days. What do you think would happen in Goulais River? It would be interesting to write a story based on the scenario. There are some people who would probably naively think that we have the stuff within us to resist the forces of evil that would rise up. Given enough time, and without the grace of God, every one of us would sink to the deepest levels of evil and depravity. Depravity. No grace at all in our lives, no righteousness. We would sink lower and lower and lower into sin. Depravity means that we have nothing in us to our credit in God's sight. Okay? There, you can get a deeper theological definition if you want to. But here we have that kind of situation where the structures of government are removed, and even though it's an evil government, notice what happened in Russia when the communism fell. Do you think that it was all wonderful and land of roses and milk and flowing honey, or when communism fell? I think a lot of people had the idea that things would just turn around overnight. What happened is the crime rate shot way up, and it really baffled sociologists. And they neglected to see that when you remove the harness of government, even oppressive and evil government, God has still ordained government to restrain evil. And even with an evil government like communism, God used them to restrain evil in the land. And that was taken away, and the crime rate, particularly in Moscow, but everywhere, just shot up because the chances of getting caught with the government being in disarray like it was very, very slim. So you can imagine what would happen if the forces of evil were just let go in any given region with a promise that no one's going to be prosecuted for 30 days. We would quickly turn our homes into fortresses. We would quickly form alliances, wouldn't we? We would quickly go for bribery and extortion and all that kind of stuff. It would be unbelievable. It would be an intriguing story. But we can count on it that we would, apart from Christ, reflect the truth of the human condition, which is totally, totally depraved. And I think that that's in part what happens when Babylon carries off all the leaders of Jerusalem away, even though they are evil and oppressive and so forth. Once that's taken away, then the place gets even worse. And here we have children in places of leadership, babes are ruling, and people shall be oppressed, every one by another, every one by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, and the base against the honorable. I'm sorry, I just really want to read from today's English. I will make boys their officials, mere children will govern them, people will oppress each other, man against man, neighbor against neighbor, the young will rise up against the old, the base against the honorable. A man will seize one of his brothers at his father's home and say, "You have a cloak, you be our leader, take charge of this heap of ruins." People will want leadership, but no one will want the office of leadership. This has already been fulfilled. I can't point to a particular place, but we're talking about the time when Babylon carried off all the leaders. But think about that. When men do not want political power, something has gone awfully wrong with society. And people in that day turned the offer of being a political leader down because they said, "I have no remedy. I have no answers to your problems." Look at our situation today. I'm amazed that anyone still wants to run for office because there doesn't seem to be any solution to our problems in our society. At any rate, God will allow children to be rebellious, independent, and oppressive. And in verse 8 it tells us that Israel's rebellion will be evident in both word and deed. Even after all this, Jerusalem staggers, Judah is fallen, their words and deeds are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. The look on their faces testifies against them. They parade their sin like Sodom, they do not hide it. Woe to them, they have brought disaster upon themselves. You know, when I see this phrase, they parade their sin like Sodom, I shudder for our day. You don't see it in the news well, I suppose you do, but I mean, down in Toronto we have, every year we have, not only in Toronto but also in some of the other major centers now, we have Gay Pride Day. Literally, they're parading their sin like Sodom. on an annual basis, more than on an annual basis. I mean, they look for every political opportunity to get the spotlight, the media spotlight, and they know how to do it. And this, I mean, I am baffled as to how long the Lord will allow this to go on yet, you know. But we are living in wicked, wicked days, because we are just like they are, parading our sin like Sodom, and in particular, the Sodomite sin. Proud of it, no attempt to hide it whatsoever. Children in high school, and even lower than that, are being encouraged to come out of the closet, and to be affirmed in their sexual orientation, you know, in quotes, of course. I was amazed as I heard on the news just a month ago, a young fellow who comes to school dressed like a girl. He's gay, and the majority of his classmates, he was suspended. The majority of his classmates, indeed the majority of the school, rallied round him in support of him and the expression of his rights. And I don't know how the case turned out, but I am really concerned about our next generation, because it seems like the tide is swinging towards evil and not towards good. Parading their sin like Sodom, they have brought disaster upon themselves. Now, look at this. People will often say the God of the Old Testament is a oppressive, dark, foreboding God. He's always punishing. He's always slaughtering people. Well, there is something called the law of the harvest. You know, Galatians tells us what a man sows, that shall he also reap. And here it tells us they are bringing disaster upon themselves. And it's repeated again in verse 11. They will be paid back for what their hands have done. It's something that they have done. You have baked your cake, now eat it. You've made your bed, now you sleep in it. This is a choice that you have made. This is the way life works. Wake up, you know. So, yes, God is a God of judgment, but His judgment is just, and He will be exalted by His justice, and we will see that in a moment. So Israel's rebellion is evident both in word and in deed, and even right in their countenance. You will see it, and we see that today too. The arrogance, the deep arrogance of their sinfulness, which results, of course, in reaping what you sow. Compare this passage with 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, and notice how times are repeating themselves. Would somebody read 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2?
For men shall be lovers of their own self, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy.
Okay. Unthankful, unholy, disobedient, lovers of themselves, proud, arrogant, all of that. Almost word for word the conditions we find in Jerusalem and Judah when Babylon comes in and it invades the land. So there is the condemnation of the leaders and the judgment against a defiant nation, a defiant and arrogant nation. I kind of like to focus in on the in every chapter. I'd like to give you guys a sermon idea, or you ladies as well, for a Bible study or whatever, sermon idea. I have no remedy. What verse was that again?
7.
Okay, verse 7. No. Oh yeah, sorry, I was looking at chapter 2. In that day shall he swear, saying, I will not be a healer, for in my house is neither bread nor clothing. Now he's saying there, I have no wealth, I have no solution. I can't give you bread, I can't give you clothing. I have no remedy. Make me not a ruler of this people. In verse 6, when a man shall take hold of his brother of the house, saying, Thou hast clothing, be thou our ruler. Clothing was a symbol of wealth. And in verse 7, where King James says, I will not be a healer, NIV says, I have no remedy, and that's virtually saying the same thing. I can't fix your problem. Okay?
Who's speaking here?
It's a hypothetical situation reflecting the conditions of the land, where conditions are so terrible, people are so poor that they will grab anyone and say, be our leader. And that individual will respond and say, I have nothing myself, I have no remedy for your solution. I have no solution to your problem, I mean. And so as a seed thought for a sermon, I think that it can easily apply to the problems that we face today. People go for counseling and they come out with 10 times as many problems. We have leaders in the land who have no remedy. And of course, the only one who has the ultimate remedy is Jesus Christ. And He is the healer, and He is the one to whom we need to bring people for bread and wine, to sustain their soul. Of course, you can go to all kinds of directions with that thought, but certainly there's lots of preaching material here. So you reap what you sow. Israel or Judah learned that firsthand. Now we come to an interesting passage where we learn that not only the men and the leaders of Judah are at fault, but the women don't escape judgment either. A very interesting portion here. Verse 16 on down through the passage. Moreover, the Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go. James, would you demonstrate for us what a minced walk looks like? Come on, get up and walk back and forth and show me what a minced walk looks like.
What does it mean?
I have no idea.
Striking nicely here.
Tripping nicely?
Yes.
Well, is that King James? Oh, is that in the margin? Tripping nicely?
Well, how do you trip nicely?
Well, let's continue reading. Wait, maybe. Let's see, verse 16. Tripping along with mincing steps, with ornaments jingling on their ankles. Okay, flirting with their eyes. Okay, walking along with outstretched necks, flirting with their eyes, tripping along with mincing steps, with ornaments jingling on their ankles. Therefore the Lord will bring sores on the heads of the women of Zion, and the Lord will make their scalps bald. In that day, the Lord will snatch away their finery, the bangles and headbands and crescent necklaces, the earrings and bracelets and veils, the headdresses and ankle chains. Now there we have a clue. They used to wear ankle chains that would disable them from taking large steps. So they would take short steps. And I think that that's got to do with the mincing gait, or whatever that means. But if somebody get a dictionary sometime and bring us a definition of the word mincing, and then maybe we'll have a fashion show and someone show us what a mincing step looks like.
That reminds me of chicken with being dressed like a chicken with
Yeah.
This picture.
Yeah. Well, Listen, let's not mock this picture more so than the tragedy of the men, because the haughtiness and the pride in men is just as wicked. But here, it's an outward thing, and that's why it seems to be more obviously humorous.
In Korea, the proverb,
Yes.
when they have adultery happen,
Yeah.
they meet their eyes,
Oh.
their minds, their each eyes.
Yeah.
They meet.
Mhm.
They meet each other.
I see.
Eyes.
Yeah.
In my parents.
Uh huh. Yeah. When they flirt with her eyes. Yes.
What is it?
18, verse 18 of chapter 3.
Can you read it? Because I don't really understand what round tires like to move on.
They're called round tires like to move. I think he was a little off there. In that day, the Lord will snatch away their finery, the bangles and headbands and crescent necklaces, moon crescents. Okay, they had ornaments in the shape of moon crescent, and that reflected some of the idolatry that other nations around them were involved in. And the crescent was a symbol of the goddess of Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth? Something like that? Or Ashtar, something like that. And so it was kind of a charm, good luck charm, whatever. That's all. But some more of the ornaments that they were wearing: chains and bracelets and mufflers, bonnets and ornaments of the legs, and headbands and tablets and earrings, rings and nose jewels, the changeable suits of apparel and the mantles and the wimples and the crisping pins. Never heard of those things. Good grief.
1611.
22. The fine robes, capes, cloaks, and purses, and mirrors, and linen garments, and tiaras, and shawls. Yeah. Anyway, it's interesting here that Isaiah lists 21 ornaments or jewelry pieces, pieces of ornaments or garments, in 3 groups of 7. That's significant. 21. 3 groups of 7. 3 times 7. Okay? 21 things are itemized that, and I wouldn't say that any one of them is wrong in and of itself. I do not believe, like my parents believed, that makeup or jewelry is sinful. I do believe that an attitude can be sinful, which will show itself in the over-adorning of oneself. And I think in these days we're talking both male and female. I'm not pro wearing an earring in your ear at all for men, but that's just because I was born when men were men and girls were girls, and never the twain shall meet. Now things are getting so confused. And so that's just a traditional personal thing. I would never allow my boy to wear an earring in his ear, because I'd raise him such that he would be just chauvinistic enough to be grossed out by that thought. And I would raise my girls to not, I like when I hear little girls saying "ew" when they, talk about boys, and boys not wanting to play with girls until the right time. I think that's good. I think that's healthy. There are healthy distinctions to be kept in a society, and when we mix our values like we're doing today, at any rate, I'm getting off track here. What I mean to say is that there is a way of wearing ornaments that does not, the way we taught our girls when we raised them, is that there's an inner beauty that is far more important than what you look like on the outside. And your inner beauty will regulate how you order your outer appearance.
Inner beauty is inside the clothes or inside
In your heart.
in the heart?
Yes. Your inner beauty will regulate your appearance on the outside, and you are never to depend on your outward appearance to make any kind of lasting impression. You do not attract boys by relying on your outward appearance, because then you're going to reap exactly what you sow. And this kind of pride and this kind of nonsense that the women were involved in here, and obviously a lot of women had a lot of time on their hands, and they got themselves all dolled up, and they'd go prancing on the streets of Jerusalem to show off, and they were wealthy ladies. I think there's all kinds of immoral activity going on as a result, and God was going to judge them for it. And look at the judgment, the nature of the judgment. First of all, the reason for their judgment is found in verse 16. It's because they are haughty. Again, pride. And out of their haughtiness, out of their pride, out of the attitude of their heart, they walk this way and they dress this way. Okay?
When I read this part, I just think about Solomon, the Song of Solomon.
Oh?
In that passage, they mention about the kind of ornaments, beauty. But in this case, it's opposite aspects of the same ornaments.
Well, here it seems to be just on the outside, because their hearts are evil. Okay?
So, simply saying is, when we lose our heart to God for justice, then all the decoration is represented the dirty or the bad marriage. And if the heart is good, then the outside is the blessing it represents the God's grace.
So, verse 16 we have the reason for their judgment, and from verse 17 to chapter 4, verse 1, we have the nature of their judgment. Okay? So let's see, in terms of your outline, I'm sorry I'm doing this to you, confusing you. Under the outline, under the heading, where is it? Judgment against a defiant nation. A, condemnation of the leaders, chapter 3, verses 1 to 15. B, condemnation of the women, chapter 3, verses 16 to chapter 4, verse 1. Then we have verse 16, the reason for the judgment, and verse 17 to chapter 4, verse 1, the nature of their judgment. The nature of their judgment is as follows. In verse 17, physical sickness which strikes at the source of their pride. They are proud of their beauty. God strikes at their beauty, and they lose their hair. And in fact, I think that's exactly what happened with the women being carried off to Babylon. They were shaved. I can't point to a passage, but well, I know that temple prostitutes in modern biblical times and in the first century were shaved. But hair being the glory covering of a woman, to have a shaved head was shameful.
Israelites would do that to one who's brought into them, shave their hair.
Caught in adultery?
No, I think taken a foreign wife or something like that.
Oh, okay. Verses 18 to 23, another aspect of the nature of their judgment, a loss of their ornamental beauty and materials. In other words, loss of their wealth. Verses 18 to 23 describes a loss of their ornamental beauty and materials. Verses 24 to 26, a loss of their freedom and their husbands. Or at least their men, if they're not married. And finally, in chapter 4, verse 1, humiliation, having to share a man if they can find one at all. 7 women cling to one man, saying, "Be our husband, be my man." hey, even if we can just borrow your name, but please take away our reproach. It was a reproach to be single in those days.
What was 19?
Reproach to be single. Nowadays it's like, don't get married.
Yeah. What was 19?
Yeah, what was, I got the loss of their wealth.
Loss of their freedom and their husbands was verses 24 to 26. Verses 18 to 23 was loss of their ornamental beauty and materials. Did you get that? Notice that the behavior of a nation's women have a powerful effect on the morals of that nation. The behavior of a nation's women have a powerful effect on the morals of the nation.